After decades of doing this, I've learned one thing for certain. People don't come onto my stage to tell the truth. They come to be heard, they come to be validated, and sometimes they come to hide in plain sight. They arrive with a carefully constructed narrative, a script they've rehearsed in their heads 1,000 times, designed to make them look like the victim or the hero of their own story. But the truth is, a stubborn thing. It has a way of leaking out through the cracks in the armor, a tremor in the voice, a glance away at the wrong moment, or the way someone's body language completely contradicts the words coming out of their mouth. I've sat across from thousands of people, and I can tell you within the first 30 seconds whether I'm looking at a person who is ready to change or a person who is just trying to survive their own lies. When Sarah walked into the studio, she had that look. It's a look I see often, the shoulders pulled tight against the ears, the eyes darting around like she's looking for the nearest exit, even when she's the one who asked to be there. She was 34 years old, but in that moment, she looked like a scared child trying to play dress-up in a grown-up's life. She came to me because her relationship with her mother, Elena, was in total collapse. On the surface, it was about money, a family-owned bakery, and a series of disappearing funds that Elena claimed Sarah had squandered. But experience has taught me that money is almost never the actual problem. Money is just the scoreboard for the emotional war being waged in the basement of the soul. Elena was a powerhouse, a woman who had built a business from nothing and carried the weight of her family on her back for 40 years. She was sharp, articulate, and deeply wounded. Sarah, on the other hand, was the black sheep, the one who could never quite get it right, the one who was always one step away from a catastrophe. I call these labels. We all have them. We get assigned a role in our family dynamic when we're young, and we spend the rest of our lives playing that part, even if it's killing us. Sarah was the failure, Elena was the provider, and as long as they stayed in those roles, they knew how to interact, even if that interaction was nothing but screaming and accusations. My job isn't just to listen to the screaming. My job is to figure out what the screaming is trying to drown out. Before I even walked out onto that stage, I spent time looking at the intake notes and the pre-interview footage. I saw a woman in Sarah who was desperate for her mother's approval, yet doing everything in her power to ensure she would never get it. That's a classic psychological paradox. If you fail, you stay connected to the person who has to pick up the pieces. Negative attention is still attention. And for some people, it's the only currency they know how to spend. I remember sitting in my dressing room, looking at the monitors, watching Sarah sit in the green room. She wasn't looking at her phone. She wasn't talking to the producers. She was just staring at her hands, twisting a small silver ring around her finger until the skin turned red. There was a heaviness to her that felt like more than just a dispute over a bank account. There was a ghost in the room with her, and I knew that if we were going to get anywhere, I was going to have to find out who that ghost was. Elena was in a separate room, paced like a caged tiger. She was ready for a fight. She had her documents, her printouts, her proof that her daughter was a liar and a thief. She wanted me to be the judge, to bang the gavel and tell Sarah she was wrong, but I don't play judge. I play truth seeker, and the truth doesn't care about your printouts. When we finally got them on stage, the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. You could feel the years of resentment radiating off both of them. I started where I always start, with the facts. I asked Elena to explain why she was there. She launched into a well-rehearsed litany of grievances. Sarah had taken over the books for the bakery 6 months ago. Since then, $20,000 had vanished. No receipts, no explanations, just a hole in the balance sheet. Elena's voice was steady, professional, and cold. She talked about her daughter like she was a problematic employee she was trying to fire but couldn't because of a labor union. She was using logic to mask her heartbreak. because if she admitted she was heartbroken that her daughter would steal from her, she'd have to admit that she had failed as a mother. And for a woman like Elena, failure was not an option she was willing to entertain. I turned to Sarah. I didn't ask her about the money. I asked her how it felt to sit 3 feet away from her mother and hear herself described as a thief. She didn't look up. She just kept twisting that ring. Her voice was a whisper, a stark contrast to Elena's steel. She said it didn't matter what she said because Elena had already made up her mind. This is what I call the shutdown. When the pain becomes too much, the ego retreats into a fortress. It's a defense mechanism, but it's also a prison. Sarah was sitting in a prison of her own making, and the bars were made of silence. I leaned in. I told her, Sarah, I've seen this movie before. I know how it ends if you don't change the script. You're going to leave here, you're going to keep fighting, and one of you is going to go to your grave with this unfinished business between you. Is that what you want? She finally looked at me, and for a second, the mask slipped. I saw the fear, not the fear of being caught, but the fear of being known. That's the most terrifying thing in the world for someone carrying a secret, the possibility that someone might actually see them for who they really are. We started digging into the backstory. I wanted to know about the father. Elena's husband, David, had passed away 3 years ago. That was the turning point. Before David died, they were a functional, if somewhat tense, family. David was the buffer. He was the one who translated Elena's intensity into love for Sarah and Sarah's insecurity into potential for Elena. When he died, the bridge went out. They were left on opposite sides of a canyon, screaming at each other but unable to hear the words. Sarah began to describe her father, and for the first time, her voice had some life in it. He was her hero. He was the only one who really got her. But as she spoke, I noticed Elena's face changing. It wasn't softening, it was hardening. There was a tension in her jaw that told me we were walking on a minefield. I've learned that when people lionize a dead relative, they often do it at the expense of the living. Sarah was using her father's memory as a shield against her mother's expectations. Dad would have understood, she said. Dad wouldn't have accused me of this. Elena let out a sharp, bitter laugh. It was the kind of sound that stops a conversation dead in its tracks. She looked at Sarah with a mixture of pity and rage and said, "Your father is the reason we're in this mess, Sarah. Your father never said no to you a day in his life, and look where it got us." That's when I realized the money wasn't the secret. The money was just the smoke. The fire was something else entirely. I had to pivot. I had to get them off the topic of the bakery and onto the topic of the man who wasn't there to defend himself. I asked Elena what she meant by that. She hesitated. For the first time, the provider was unsure of her footing. She looked at the audience, then back at me, her eyes searching for a way out. But I stayed on her. I told her, Elena, you can't heal what you don't acknowledge. There is a weight in this room that belongs to David, and we need to put it on the table. You see, when a family loses a patriarch, there's usually a rush to canonize him. He becomes a saint, a man who could do no wrong, and any memory of his flaws gets buried right along with him. But that leaves the survivors in a very dangerous position. If the dead man was perfect, then any problems left behind must be the fault of those still breathing. Elena had spent 3 years carrying the burden of David's perfection, and it was clearly starting to crush her. I could see the resentment boiling just under the surface. It wasn't just about the $20,000. It was about a lifetime of being a bad cop while David got to be the hero. I looked at Elena and I told her, "You're angry at a dead man, aren't you?" The audience went silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Elena's eyes welled up, but she didn't let a tear fall. She was too disciplined for that. She nodded just once, a sharp, jerky movement. She told me that David had a way with people, but he didn't have a way with numbers. He had left the bakery in a shambles, a mess of debt and unfulfilled promises that she had been quietly cleaning up for years. Sarah sat there, shaking her head, her face turning a deep, angry red. She started to defend him, to say that her father would never have kept secrets from her. And that's when the escalation really began. We call this the clash of realities. Two people can live in the same house, eat at the same table, and experience two completely different lives. To Sarah, David was the soft place to land. To Elena, David was the hole in the bucket she was desperately trying to fill. The tension between them wasn't just about the present. It was a decades-long war over who David really was. And Sarah was using her version of her father as a weapon against her mother. Every time Elena tried to hold her accountable for the missing money, Sarah would retreat into the memory of her kind father who would never treat her this way. It was a brilliant, if unconscious, manipulation. If she could make Elena the villain, she didn't have to face her own choices. I turned my attention back to the money. I've seen enough financial records to know that money doesn't just disappear. It goes somewhere. It goes to a habit, it goes to a person, or it goes to a fantasy. I asked Sarah point blank, where did the $20,000 go? Don't give me a story about receipts or bad bookkeeping. Tell me where the cash is. She looked at me, and for the first time, she didn't look scared, she looked defiant. She told me she spent it on life, rent, car payments, groceries, but the math didn't add up. You don't spend $20,000 on life in 6 months unless you're living a life you can't afford. I looked at her and said, Sarah, you're lying to me. And the problem with lying to me is that I don't have any emotional skin in your game. I'm not your mother. I'm not your late father. I'm a man who looks at patterns, and your pattern is one of avoidance. I explained to her that when people feel like they can never measure up, they often stop trying. They decide that if they're going to be the failure, they might as well be a spectacular one. It's a way of taking control of the narrative. If you fail on your own terms, it doesn't hurt as much when people call you a loser. But there was something else. I noticed that every time I mentioned the specific amount of money, Sarah's eyes flickered toward her mother with a strange intensity. It wasn't guilt. It was something closer to expectation. She was waiting for Elena to say something, and Elena was holding back. I've done this long enough to recognize when two people are dancing around a secret they both know but neither wants to name. They were using this public stage to play a game of chicken, waiting to see who would break first. I decided to push harder on the backstory of those 6 months. I asked Sarah to walk me through a typical day at the bakery. She described the early mornings, the smell of the flour, the sound of the ovens. She spoke with a genuine passion for the work. This wasn't a woman who hated her job. This was a woman who loved the craft but was drowning in the business. I asked her why she took over the books if she knew she wasn't good with numbers. She said she wanted to prove to her mother that she could be trusted. And how's that working for you, I asked. It's a question I use a lot because it cuts through the excuses. If your strategy is to prove you're trustworthy by losing $20,000, then your strategy is a failure. You're not proving you're capable, you're proving your mother's worst fears about you are true. I asked her if she realized that by failing, she was actually giving her mother exactly what she wanted, a reason to stay in control. This is the toxic bond. Elena needed to be the savior, Sarah needed to be saved. As long as Sarah was a mess, Elena had a purpose. As long as Elena was the boss, Sarah had an excuse for her own inadequacies. They were locked in a dance that was exhausting both of them, but neither knew how to stop the music. I told them they were codependent in a way that is destroying the very thing you claim to love, which is this family legacy. Elena started to argue. She said she didn't want to be in control, that she was tired, that she wanted to retire. She said she gave Sarah the books because she wanted to step back. But I challenged her on that. I asked her how many times a day she checked the accounts behind Sarah's back. She admitted she did it every single evening. I told her, then you didn't give her the books. You gave her a test, you expected her to fail, and then you hovered over her until she did. The temperature in the room was rising. Sarah was crying now. Real tears, not the performative ones I'd seen earlier. She told her mother that she felt like she was suffocating. She said that every time she walked into that bakery, she felt the ghost of her father and the judgment of her mother, and she just wanted to scream. She admitted that she had taken some of the money, not all of it, but some to pay off a debt she had hidden from everyone. What debt, Sarah? I asked. My voice was low, steady. I knew we were getting close to the confrontation phase, the moment where the air gets thin and the truth starts to claw its way out. She hesitated. She looked at the floor, then at the cameras, then at me. It wasn't for me, she whispered. It was for him. For who? For David, I asked. Elena froze. She looked like she had been struck by lightning. She leaned forward, her voice a low hiss. What are you talking about, Sarah? Your father is gone. How could you be paying a debt for him? Sarah finally looked her mother in the eye. The fear was gone, replaced by a raw, jagged kind of pain. He wasn't perfect, Mom. He wasn't the saint you pretend he was to everyone else. And he wasn't the failure you whisper about when you think, I'm not listening. He was a man with a problem, and he made me promise never to tell you. This was the escalation I had sensed. The secret wasn't just Sarah's. It was a multi-generational web of silence and protection. Sarah had been carrying her father's secret for 3 years, and she had been stealing from the bakery to pay off the people he owed money to, people who didn't care that he was dead. They just wanted their cash. I sat back and let that sink in. The failure daughter was actually the one trying to protect the perfect father's reputation, while the provider mother was the one unknowingly demanding the money that was being used to keep the family's secrets buried. It was a mess. A total, absolute psychological train wreck, and they were right in the middle of it. I looked at Elena. You knew he had a problem, didn't you? Elena didn't answer right away. She looked down at her lap, her hands trembling. I knew he was careless, she said softly. I didn't know it was this bad. It was bad enough that your daughter felt she had to become a thief to cover for him, I said. It was bad enough that she let you label her a failure, a loser, and a criminal, just so you wouldn't have to know the truth about the man you were married to for 30 years. How does that sit with you? The silence that followed was heavy, the kind of silence that has weight and texture. It was the sound of a family's foundation cracking wide open right there on stage. Elena looked like she had been punched in the gut. She stared at Sarah, and for the first time since they sat down, she wasn't looking at a failure or a thief. She was looking at a daughter she didn't recognize at all. I let that silence breathe. In therapy, silence is often where the most work gets done. It's where people have to sit with the reality of what's just been said without the noise of their own defenses to protect them. I leaned forward, looking directly at Sarah. I wanted to know the mechanics of this secret. I asked her, Sarah, what kind of debt are we talking about? Was it gambling? Was it bad investments? Who were these people you were paying off? She took a shaky breath and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She told me it was a mix of both. David had always been a big dreamer, the kind of man who was always one deal away from a fortune. But the deals were never quite as solid as he claimed. He had borrowed money from people who weren't banks, local investors who didn't care about balance sheets or business plans. They just wanted their high interest payments on time. When David died, the investors didn't send flowers, they sent messages to Sarah. They knew she was the softest target, the one who worshiped her father and would do anything to keep his saintly image intact for her mother. They told her that if she didn't pay, they would go to Elena and the bakery would be the first thing they took. So Sarah did what she thought a loyal daughter should do. She tried to save the family's honor by sacrificing her own. "You've been playing a dangerous game of choose your poison," Sarai said. "On one hand, you could tell your mother the truth and watch her world crumble. On the other hand, you could stay silent, steal from the business to pay the debts, and let her hate you for it. You chose to be hated. Why?" She looked at me, her voice breaking. "Because my mom lost everything when he died. She lost her partner, her best friend. If she knew he'd lied to her for years, if she knew he'd put the bakery at risk, it would have killed her. I thought I could handle it. I thought I could just fix it quietly." I turned to Elena. "Do you hear what she's saying? She wasn't stealing for greed. She was stealing for protection. She was trying to protect you from a truth she thought you couldn't handle." But here's the kicker. By protecting you from the truth, she's been feeding you a lie about who she is. She's been letting you believe she's a common criminal so you could keep believing your husband was a hero. Is that a fair trade? Elena was shaking her head, her face buried in her hands. The provider persona was gone. She was just a woman realizing she'd been living in a house of cards. She whispered that she had suspected David was sloppy with money, but she'd always stepped in to fix it. She had spent their entire marriage being the practical one, the one who handled the reality while David handled the charm. She realized now that she hadn't just been cleaning up after him, she'd been enabling a pattern that eventually trapped her daughter. This is what I mean when I talk about family systems. Nobody acts in a vacuum. Every behavior is a response to someone else's behavior. David was the dreamer because Elena was the realist. Sarah became the secret keeper because she saw that Elena couldn't handle the truth. They were all playing their parts in a script that was written years ago. But the problem with a script is that it doesn't allow for growth. It only allows for more of the same. I told them, "You two have been fighting over $20,000 while the house was burning down around you. This money isn't the issue. The issue is that you don't trust each other. Elena, you didn't trust Sarah to be capable, and Sarah, you didn't trust Elena to be strong." I had to get Sarah to realize the damage she had done to herself. I asked her, "Do you understand that by saving your father's reputation, you've effectively destroyed your own life? You've lost your mother's trust, you've put your career in jeopardy, and you're sitting on national television being called a thief. Was his memory worth all that?" She didn't answer right away. She was looking at the floor again. I told her, "You can't set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm, even if that someone is your father. And you certainly can't do it when that person isn't even here to see the sacrifice you're making." We were deep into the confrontation phase. Now, this wasn't just a discussion, it was an interrogation of the soul. I started to pull apart the layers of their relationship. I pointed out how Elena's constant criticism had actually made it easier for Sarah to keep the secret. If your mother already thinks you're a screw-up, what's one more mistake? It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Elena had created an environment where Sarah felt that being a thief was more believable than being a hero. "Elena," I said, "you've been using your standards as a weapon. You've held them over Sarah's head like a guillotine. You've made it so that she felt she could never be enough for you. So when she found herself in a hole, she didn't come to you for help. She went deeper into the hole because she was more afraid of your judgment than she was of the people her father owed money to. How does that make you feel as a mother? Elena looked up, her eyes red and raw. I failed her, she said. It was the first time she'd used that word about herself. I thought I was being strong for her. I thought I was showing her how to be a professional, how to run a business. I didn't realize I was making her afraid of me. Strength without empathy is just bullying, I told her. And empathy without strength is just enabling. You two have been on opposite ends of that spectrum, and you've both been missing the middle ground where a mother and daughter are supposed to live. I then looked at the escalation of the debt itself. Sarah admitted that the $20,000 she took wasn't even the half of it. She'd been using her own savings, selling her jewelry, doing anything to keep those investors at bay. The pressure had become unbearable. That's why she finally agreed to come on the show. She knew she couldn't keep the plate spinning anymore. She knew she was going to crash, and she wanted someone, me, to be there when the impact happened. I've seen this many times. People come to me when they're at the end of their rope, not because they want to be fixed, but because they want permission to let go of the rope. Sarah was exhausted. She was tired of the lies, tired of the stealing, tired of the shame. She wanted the truth to come out, but she was too afraid to be the one to say it out loud without a mediator. I asked her, what did you think was going to happen today? Did you think I'd just catch you in a lie and that would be the end of it? I thought you'd hate me, she said. I thought everyone would hate me, but I just couldn't carry it anymore, Dr. Phil. It was too heavy. The truth is never as heavy as a lie, I said. A lie requires maintenance. You have to remember who you told what to, you have to keep track of the stories, and you have to live with the fear of being found out. The truth just is. You say it once, and then you deal with the consequences. But the consequences of the truth are almost always better than the consequences of a lie. I turned back to the audience for a moment, making sure they understood the psychological weight of what we were seeing. This wasn't just family drama. This was a case study in how secrets can act like a cancer in a family. They start small, one little omission, one little protection, and they grow until they take over every healthy part of the relationship. Sarah and Elena hadn't had a real conversation in 3 years because every word they spoke had to navigate around the massive elephant of David's debt. I looked at Elena and said, now you have a choice. You can stay angry about the money, which is gone and isn't coming back. You can stay angry at Sarah for the way she handled it, or you can look at the fact that your daughter was willing to throw her own life away just to try and protect you. If that isn't a twisted, dysfunctional form of love, I don't know what is. The question is, can you forgive the twisted part and see the love part? Elena looked at Sarah, and for the first time, the steel in her expression completely dissolved. It was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. She didn't look like a business owner anymore. She looked like a woman who had just realized she'd been living in a house of mirrors. I watched her carefully. This is the moment I'm always looking for, the point where the defenses are exhausted and the person is finally vulnerable enough to hear the truth. It's a painful place to be, but it's the only place where real change can actually start. I turned back to Sarah and I said, you've spent 3 years being a martyr, Sarah. But let me tell you something about martyrs. They usually end up dead, and they take everyone else down with them. You thought you were being noble by protecting your father's memory, but what you were actually doing was playing God. You decided what your mother could and couldn't handle. You decided that your father's reputation was more important than your own integrity. You took it upon yourself to be the judge, the jury, and the executioner of your own life. Who gave you that right? Sarah's head snapped up. She looked stunned. She had expected me to praise her for her sacrifice, or at least to go easy on her because her intentions were good. But I don't give points for good intentions that lead to bad results. I tell people all the time, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, but the destination is still hell. Sarah had created a hell for herself and her mother, and she was looking for a pat on the back for it. "I was just trying to help," she cried out. "I didn't want her to hurt any more than she already was." "And how's that working for you, Sarah?" I ask. "Is she hurting less now? Is your relationship better? Is the bakery more secure?" "No, she's hurting more because she thinks her daughter is a thief. The relationship is destroyed because there's no trust. And the bakery is $20,000 in the hole with a line of creditors at the door. Your help has been a catastrophe." I let that sink in. I wanted her to feel the weight of her choices, not to be mean, but to be effective. You can't fix a problem until you own it. And Sarah hadn't been owning her choices. She'd been blaming them on her love for her father. I've seen this 1,000 times. People use love as a justification for all kinds of toxic behavior. They lie out of love, they control out of love, they enable out of love. But real love is based on truth and respect, not on secrets and manipulation. I looked at Elena. You heard what she said. She didn't think you were strong enough to handle the truth about David. She looked at you, the woman who built this business, the woman who raised her, the woman who's been the rock of this family, and she thought, Mom's too weak. I have to protect her. How does that feel, Elena? To be seen as so fragile by your own child that she'd rather become a criminal than tell you the truth? Elena's voice was barely a whisper. It feels like I've been a stranger in my own home. I thought I knew my husband, I thought I knew my daughter, but I realize now that I only knew the parts they wanted me to see. I spent all my time correcting Sarah, trying to make her better, because I thought she was the one with the problem. I didn't see that the problem was already there, right under my nose, with David. She turned to Sarah, her eyes searching her daughter's face. Why didn't you just tell me? Why didn't you come to me the second those men contacted you? Because you were already so disappointed in me, Sarah screamed. The outburst was sudden, raw, and loud. It echoed in the studio. You always looked at me like I was a project that never got finished. If I told you Dad owed money, you would have just added it to the list of things I was failing at. I wanted to be the one who fixed it, just once. I wanted to be the one who saved the day instead of the one who ruined it. This was the breakthrough moment. This was the raw, ugly truth. Sarah wasn't just protecting her father, she was trying to buy her mother's respect with stolen money. She was trying to earn a hero badge to replace the failure label she'd been wearing her whole life. It was a tragic, misguided attempt at redemption. She was so desperate for her mother's approval that she was willing to destroy herself to get it. I leaned back and took a breath. I wanted to bridge the gap between them. I told them, you two are caught in a cycle of performance versus judgment. Sarah, you're performing a role you think will earn you love. Elena, you're judging her performance based on a standard that no one can meet. Neither of you is being real. You're both playing characters in a tragedy, and you're both waiting for the other one to change the ending. But the ending won't change until you both stop acting and start being honest. I pointed out that Elena's willful blindness played a part in this too. Elena, you're a smart woman. You're a businesswoman. You had to know the numbers with David didn't always add up. You had to see the signs that he was overextending himself. But you chose not to look. Why? Because it was easier to let him be the charming dreamer while you handled the heavy lifting. You liked the dynamic because it gave you the moral high ground. But the high ground is a lonely place to live when your family is drowning in the valley below. Elena nodded slowly. She didn't fight me on it. She was past the point of fighting. She admitted that she had sensed David's instability for years, but had developed a habit of fixing things before they became problems. She'd made it so easy for him to be irresponsible that she had effectively trained him to keep secrets. And then she'd turned that same energy towards Sarah, constantly fixing her life until Sarah felt she had no autonomy left. I looked at both of them and said, we have to talk about the ghost of David. He's not here to defend himself, but he's the one who set this all in motion. He left you both with a mess, a financial mess and an emotional mess. And as long as you keep him on a pedestal, you're going to keep tripping over the reality of who he was. You have to give yourself permission to be angry at him. You have to give yourself permission to say, he let us down. Because until you do that, you're going to keep taking that anger out on each other. Sarah started to sob, not the quiet, controlled crying from before, but deep, racking sobs. It was the sound of a 3-year-old burden finally being put down. She admitted she hated her father for what he'd done. She hated him for making her promise to stay quiet. She hated him for leaving her with his debts and his lies. And she hated herself for being so weak that she couldn't say no. You weren't weak, Sarah, I said, my voice softening. You were a daughter who loved her father, but love doesn't require you to be a co-conspirator in a lie. You've been a good daughter to a man who didn't deserve that level of protection at the expense of your mother. Now, it's time to be a good daughter to the woman who is actually still here. I looked at the audience. I wanted them to understand that this wasn't just about one family's bakery. It was about the legacy of silence. Every family has secrets, but it's the secrets we keep to protect others that do the most damage. They create a divide that can't be crossed because the bridge is built on a foundation of lies. The confrontation is over, I told them. Now, we have to talk about the outcome. We have to decide what the next chapter looks like. Are you going to go back to the bakery and keep pretending everything is fine while you struggle to pay back these investors? Or are you going to close the book on David's secrets and start a new chapter based on the truth? Elena reached over and took Sarah's hand. It was the first time they'd touched since the show started. It was a small gesture, but in the context of their relationship, it was huge. Elena said, the bakery is just a building, Sarah. The money is just paper. I don't care about any of it if I don't have you. We'll figure the money out. We'll talk to the lawyers. We'll talk to the police if we have to, but the lying has to stop today. I need my daughter back. As the stage lights dimmed slightly and the audience took a collective breath, I knew we had reached the tipping point. The confrontation had done its job. It had cracked the shell of the lie. But as I've said 1,000 times, an epiphany without a plan is just a dream. We couldn't just leave them there with their raw emotions and a $20,000 hole in their lives. We had to pivot to the outcome. And that meant moving from the why to the what now. I looked at Sarah, who was still trembling, and I looked at Elena, who was holding her daughter's hand with a grip that spoke of a new kind of determination. I told them, listen to me, and listen close. You've spent 3 years living in a ghost story. You've let a dead man's mistakes dictate your reality. But that ends today. We are going to strip the power away from these investors. We are going to strip the power away from the shame. And we are going to rebuild this family on a foundation that can actually hold weight. I explained that the first step was transparency. No more protecting each other from the truth. If the bakery was in trouble, they faced it together. If Sarah felt overwhelmed, she spoke up. If Elena felt the urge to criticize, she paused and asked herself if she was being a coach or a judge. I had my team step in immediately. We didn't just give them a good luck and a handshake. We provided them with a top-tier legal team to handle the investors. In many cases like this, these debts are legally questionable at best and criminal at worst. By bringing in professional representation, we took the target off Sarah's back. Those men wouldn't be calling a scared 34-year-old anymore. They'd be calling a law firm that doesn't blink. I could see the literal weight lift off Sarah's shoulders when I told her she didn't have to handle the phone calls anymore. That's the power of shifting from a secret mindset to a system mindset. But the financial fix was only half the battle. The real work was internal. Sarah needed to find out who she was when she wasn't the failure or the secret keeper. She had spent so long defining herself by her father's needs and her mother's expectations that she had no idea what her own voice sounded like. I arranged for her to start intensive individual therapy to work on her self-worth and her boundaries. She had to learn that saying no to a toxic secret is the highest form of self-love. Elena had her own mountain to climb. She had to learn how to be a mother to a grown woman, not a supervisor to a subordinate. She had to grieve David all over again. Not the Saint David she'd been sold, but the real man who had failed her and their daughter. That's a bitter pill to swallow after 30 years of marriage, but it's the only pill that cures the resentment. I told her, Elena, you can love the man and still be furious at the choices he made. Those two things can exist in the same heart. But you can't punish Sarah for the ghost sins. In the weeks following the show, the updates started coming in. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, because real life doesn't work that way. Recovery is messy, and it's a 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of process. The bakery did eventually have to be sold. The financial damage David had done, combined with the missing funds Sarah had diverted, was too much to overcome in the current market. But here's the thing, they sold it together. It wasn't a defeat, it was a strategic withdrawal. They used the remaining equity to settle the debts and give them both a fresh start. Sarah found a job working in a different industry entirely, somewhere she could build a reputation from scratch without the shadow of the family legacy hanging over her. She told our producers that for the first time in her adult life, she didn't wake up with a knot of dread in her stomach. She and Elena started meeting for lunch once a week, not to talk about business, not to talk about fixing things, but just to talk. They were learning how to be friends. I think about that case often because it perfectly illustrates the price of protection. We think we're being kind when we keep secrets to spare someone pain, but we're actually just stealing their opportunity to be brave. Elena was a lot stronger than Sarah gave her credit for, and Sarah was a lot more loyal than Elena realized. They just needed the truth to act as the catalyst to see each other clearly. The outcome of any story is rarely about the money or the business. It's about the people. It's about whether they choose to stay stuck in the backstory or whether they have the courage to write a new one. Sarah and Elena chose the new story. They chose the hard truth over the comfortable lie. And as I always say, you can't change what you don't acknowledge. Once they acknowledge the mess, they could finally start cleaning it up. It takes a lot of guts to stand on a stage and say, I told a secret I never planned to say out loud. But on the other side of that secret is freedom. Sarah found her freedom, and in doing so, she gave her mother back her daughter. That's why I do this, not for the drama, but for the breakthrough. Because when the truth finally comes out, it's like the sun breaking through a thick fog. Everything changes. The path is still long, and the hills are still steep, but at least now they can see where they're going. And they're walking it together, which is the only way any family ever makes it through the dark.